Imagine a country that did not yet exist. There was no United States of America, no American superpower, no enormous military with bases around the world. There were only 13 British colonies on the eastern coast of North America, and in 1775, those colonies found themselves in a war against one of the most powerful empires on earth. The people who stood against the British were not members of the modern American army. Many were farmers, workers, tradesmen, and local militia members who had little experience fighting a professional European army. Yet from this struggle an army would emerge, an army that would fight in the American Revolution, expand across a growing nation, survive the bloodiest conflict in American history, fight 2 world wars, confront the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and eventually become one of the most technologically advanced land forces in the world. This is the story of the United States Army. Its history officially begins on June 14, 1775. At the time, the American colonies were already in open conflict with British forces. Fighting had erupted at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and the colonies realized that local militias alone would not be enough. The Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington accepted command under incredibly difficult circumstances. The new army lacked many things that modern armies take for granted. There were shortages of weapons, ammunition, food, clothing, and trained officers. Many soldiers were volunteers with limited military experience, while Britain possessed a professional army with generations of military tradition behind it. The Americans suffered serious defeats, especially around New York. Washington's army was pushed back, soldiers deserted, supplies became scarce. Morale dropped, and at several points the entire revolution seemed dangerously close to collapse. But Washington understood that the Americans did not necessarily need to win every battle. They needed to keep their army alive. As long as the Continental Army survived, the revolution survived. One of the most difficult moments came during the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge. Thousands of American soldiers endured freezing temperatures, hunger, disease, and terrible living conditions. But Valley Forge also became an important period of military training. With the help of experienced officers, including the Prussian military instructor Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, American soldiers received more systematic training and discipline. The army slowly became more organized. Then the strategic situation began to change. France entered the war on the American side, providing crucial military and financial assistance. In 1781, American and French forces surrounded the British Army commanded by General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. After a siege, Cornwallis surrendered. The American Revolution was effectively decided. The United States had won its independence, but winning independence created another question: what should happen to the army? The new American government and public were deeply suspicious of permanent standing armies. The Continental Army was largely disbanded after the war, although a small regular military force remained. The United States was now an independent country, but it still had to defend its territory. Over the following decades, the American army continued to develop. In 1812, the United States went to war with Britain again. The War of 1812 exposed weaknesses in American military organization and preparation. British forces eventually captured Washington, D.C., and burned important government buildings, including the White House and Capitol. But the war also produced important American military leaders. One of the most famous was Andrew Jackson, whose forces defeated a major British attack at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. The war ended without a decisive change to the borders of the United States, but it helped strengthen American national identity and influence the development of the country's military institutions. During the 19th century, the United States expanded rapidly. The army was involved in conflicts across a growing nation and fought in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. That conflict was important not only because of its impact on the territory of the United States, but also because several officers who gained experience during the war would later become major figures in the American Civil War. Among them were Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. But the greatest military crisis in American history was still ahead. In 1861, the United States entered a civil war. The country divided between the Union and the Confederacy. The Union Army expanded dramatically as the conflict continued. What began as a conflict involving relatively limited forces eventually became a massive industrial war. Railroads allowed armies and supplies to move over enormous distances. Telegraph communications allowed commanders to transmit information faster than ever before. factories produced enormous quantities of weapons and ammunition. And new technologies, including improved artillery, rifles, ironclad warships, and early military applications of photography and communications, changed warfare. The battles were devastating: Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, Chancellorsville, Atlanta, and many others. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died during the conflict. One of the Union's most important commanders eventually became Ulysses S. Grant. Grant understood that the Confederacy's military strength depended on its ability to continue fighting. He coordinated pressure across multiple fronts and eventually forced Confederate armies into a position from which they could no longer effectively continue the war. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War was coming to an end. The Union had survived, slavery was abolished, and the United States Army had emerged from the conflict larger, more experienced, and fundamentally transformed. But the Army's history did not stop there. The United States continued to grow economically and technologically. By the beginning of the 20th century, warfare itself was changing. Industrial production was transforming weapons. Machine guns were becoming more effective. Artillery was becoming more powerful. Railroads could move enormous armies, and aircraft were beginning to appear on the battlefield. Then Europe descended into a massive war. World War I began in 1914. For several years, the United States remained outside the conflict. But in 1917, America entered the war. The U.S. Army expanded rapidly. Large numbers of American soldiers were sent to Europe, where they faced trench warfare, artillery bombardments, machine guns, poison gas, and conditions unlike anything most Americans had ever experienced. American troops participated in major operations during the final stages of the war. Then, in 1918, the fighting ended. World War I had demonstrated how industrial technology could transform warfare. But the world would soon face a conflict even larger. In 1939, World War II began in Europe. For the first 2 years, the United States remained officially outside the war. Then everything changed. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II. The American military expanded on an enormous scale. Millions of Americans would eventually serve. The U.S. Army fought in North Africa, Italy, Western Europe, and the Pacific. American soldiers participated in some of the largest military operations in history. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of Allied troops landed along the beaches of Normandy. American forces faced German defenses while attempting to establish a foothold in occupied France. The fighting was intense, but the Allied forces succeeded in establishing a major beachhead. From Normandy, Allied armies pushed across France and toward Germany. American soldiers fought through difficult battles, including the Battle of the Bulge during the winter of 1944 and 1945. At the same time, American forces were fighting Japan across the Pacific. By 1945, Nazi Germany had been defeated. Japan surrendered later that year. World War II was over. The United States had emerged from the conflict as one of the world's most powerful nations. And the U.S. Army had become a truly global military force. But another confrontation was already beginning. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as rival superpowers. This became known as the Cold War. The two nations avoided direct full-scale war against each other, but competed politically, economically, technologically, and militarily across the world. For the U.S. Army, the possibility of a major war in Europe remained a central concern. But in 1950, another conflict erupted in Asia. North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The United States responded as part of a United Nations military effort. American soldiers fought in extremely difficult conditions. The Korean War involved large conventional battles, mountainous terrain, harsh weather, and rapidly changing front lines. The fighting eventually stopped with an armistice in 1953. The Korean peninsula remained divided. Then came Vietnam. The Vietnam War became one of the most difficult and controversial conflicts in American history. American forces supported South Vietnam against communist North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong. But Vietnam was not a conventional battlefield like World War II. Dense jungle, guerrilla warfare, ambushes, hidden movement, and difficult terrain created enormous challenges. American soldiers faced an enemy that could disappear into the environment and choose when and where to attack. The United States eventually withdrew its forces. In 1975, South Vietnam fell. The experience had a profound impact on the American military. The Army studied the failures and successes of Vietnam and began changing its training, doctrine, organization, and technology. During the late Cold War, the United States increasingly focused on developing highly trained forces supported by advanced technology. Helicopters became an important part of battlefield mobility, night vision technology improved, communications became faster, armored vehicles became more capable, and precision-guided weapons began changing how modern militaries fought. Then, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States helped lead an international coalition to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. In early 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. The U.S. Army deployed powerful armored formations, including Moan Abrams tanks. The coalition campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of American training, logistics, air power, intelligence, and advanced weapons. The ground offensive moved extremely quickly. Iraqi forces were defeated and Kuwait was liberated. But another event would completely change America's military priorities. September 11, 2001. Terrorist attacks struck the United States. The country entered a new era of warfare. Later that year, American forces entered Afghanistan. The U.S. Army became heavily involved in operations against the Taliban and other militant groups. Then, in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The initial conventional fighting moved quickly, but after the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, the nature of the conflict changed. American soldiers faced insurgent attacks, roadside bombs, ambushes, and urban warfare. Instead of simply fighting another nation's conventional army, they were operating in a complex environment where military operations, intelligence, security, and interaction with local populations became deeply connected. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan continued for many years. Thousands of American service members were killed, many more were wounded, and millions of people were affected by the conflicts. The experience again forced the Army to adapt. Today, the United States Army is very different from the force George Washington commanded in 1775. Modern American soldiers operate with advanced communications, satellite systems, unmanned aircraft, sophisticated intelligence networks, armored vehicles, helicopters, precision weapons, night vision equipment, and increasingly advanced digital systems. But technology is only one part of the story. The Army's greatest transformation may be the transformation of the soldier himself. The Continental soldiers of 1775 were often citizen volunteers with limited training. Today's U.S. Army is a professional force with specialized training, complex logistics, advanced education, and highly developed command structures. Its history spans more than 2.5 centuries. It began with a small revolutionary army fighting for independence. It survived defeats, shortages, and internal conflict. It fought a devastating civil war. It expanded through 2 world wars. It confronted the Soviet Union. It fought in Korea and Vietnam. It demonstrated overwhelming conventional power in the Gulf War, and it spent decades fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States Army has changed with every generation. Weapons changed, technology changed, battlefields changed, enemies changed, and the missions changed. But one thing remained constant: the Army had to adapt. Because military history is not simply a story about weapons or battles, it is a story about people. The commanders who made decisions, the soldiers who carried them out, the engineers who built the equipment, the medics who saved lives, the logisticians who kept armies supplied, and the millions of Americans who served across generations, from the 13 colonies of 1775 to the modern United States. The story of the U.S. Army is also part of the story of America itself, and its history is still being written, because the Army that began as a revolutionary force more than 250 years ago is still preparing for the battles of tomorrow.